Hi, and welcome to Versus Trump, the podcast where we talk about how the Trump administration is breaking the law and what people are doing about it. I'm your host, Charlie Gerstein. I'm here with only Isha and on today. Jason's on vacation.
Hi, Charlie. You're doing a great job with these hosting duties.
This is my first hosting assignment, so I hope you guys bear with me. We're also recording this essentially live. It is currently Wednesday morning. We're going to be giving this to you on Thursday morning because we're going to cover a rapidly developing story, the release of various memos regarding FISA applications for Carter Page surveillance. And while we're talking about that, we are going to delve into a whole host of other interesting legal issues surrounding it. Isha, are we excited about this?
We are so excited.
I feel like I know the answer. We're very excited about this.
Have you seen this hashtag memo, like MEH, like it was kind of a nothing burger? Memo.
That's funny. And on the other, but that's not going to stop us from talking about it for the better part of an hour.
But
yes. So with that in mind, the important stuff, tweet at us. Send us an email at versustrumpodcast.com. There's a hotline that no one's ever called. We'll have it. Maybe somebody can call, ask your question. We'll answer it. God forbid. And rate us on iTunes, only if your rating is good. Don't rate us if it's bad. We've gotten some good ratings so far. I think they've all been 5 stars. Let's keep that coming. So let's get started. Okay, so late last week, and then another memo earlier this week, the Republican Intelligence Committees in the House and Senate released memos. And these memos purport to detail bias at the FBI and in the rest of the intelligence community when they were seeking what is called a FISA warrant, or Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant, against Carter Page, a one-time Trump campaign advisor and alleged Russian stooge. So, Isha, what do you want to talk about first? Should we talk about what FISA is and how it works?
So let's do what FISA is and how it works. Then we're going to kind of go through the memo just so that people have some context about the content, although neither you nor I have a law enforcement background, and so we'll just be kind of reiterating what people have sort of said on the internet. And then finally, maybe we can close with a discussion of whether there was any wrongdoing, even if the Republican memo is accurate, which it seems to almost certainly not be.
Yes, that sounds great. And then after that, I think we should talk about a recent filing by the New York Times seeking information from the FISA court, which is interesting, and then a couple other various and sundry Russia matters, right, which we will talk about later.
This is the all Russia episode, guys.
Okay, yeah, updates. Okay, so FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in the early 70s, and it establishes a secret court that used to meet in the FBI headquarters and now meets in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia building. And this court has, I think, about a dozen judges. They're appointed by the Chief Justice. They're all regular federal judges, and they hear applications for warrants to do surveillance on people who are suspected to be agents of foreign powers or terrorists, but mostly the former. And the way this works is basically just like the way a regular warrant application works before a federal district judge, which is the government presents the facts of its case, alleging that this person is participating in foreign intelligence activities against the United States, and they can get a 90-day permission slip to wiretap that person, to search that person's premises, and to do other stuff to that person. And that is what happened to Carter Page.
So, and we should note that it's certainly the case that it is roughly the kind of regular probable cause standard, and we'll talk about what that entails. But it's not probable cause of sort of any criminal wrongdoing. It's probable cause of this very specific thing, which is essentially some kind of collusion with a foreign operative. And part of the reason that FISA was passed and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was created was because the Supreme Court kind of expressed doubts in an opinion that a warrant would be needed to, for example, wiretap a foreign citizen who's outside the United States. So this was a Congress that was slightly more concerned with civil liberties than our current Congress and wanted to pass some mechanism to ensure that the Fourth Amendment's warrant protection extended to that situation. So that's sort of the genesis of the FISA court.
Yeah, that's right, Isha. So thank you for pointing that out. And there's a distinction in FISA between U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons. There's no dispute that Carter Page is a U.S. person, and so he is subject to the more restrictive provisions of FISA, which require probable cause of foreign intelligence activity, essentially, as Isha just described. So that's a basic setup here. And Isha, you want to say what happened that got this all started?
How this all started? Well, one thing about the memo is it kind of provides us with some, to the extent it's accurate, it provides us with some confirmation about how this all started. So the Republican narrative or anti-Mueller story is that this whole thing started with this Steele dossier. So Steele is this former MI6 agent. He compiles this dossier that includes some kind of scandalous, gossipy, scandalous stuff about Trump, but also includes some very serious allegations about Russia. He gets it to the FBI. The Republican narrative is this guy Steele, who was taking money from Clinton backers, put this thing together, and then the FBI, even though it was sort of this thing compiled by someone with a real kind of a political axe to grind, takes this seriously. One thing that this memo kind of reveals or acknowledges for the first time, this has been made clear in New York Times reporting, but the Republicans have sort of called this into question, is that the investigation actually began much earlier. So the Steele dossier makes its way to the FBI in 2016, and it seems pretty clear from the way that this memo is written that this investigation into kind of the Russia situation began as early as 2013 with George Papadopoulos, which again is something the New York Times has reported, but Republicans have sort of denied. So that's kind of piece one of what this memo reveals. The other stuff seems to be, as we said, kind of meh. So there's kind of 3 allegations of wrongdoing the memo seems to be kind of trying to make, all of which seem to be kind of roundly debunked in the popular press. So the kind of headline allegation is they used the Steele dossier to get this warrant, but they didn't disclose to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that this dossier was sort of politically motivated. We'll talk a little bit more about whether they actually needed to do that, but in any event, the Washington Post is reporting that, in fact, although the warrant application didn't specifically say, DNC, it did make clear that there was some political motivation here. So that's sort of nothing burger number 1. Nothing burger number 2 is the memo makes an issue of the fact that there is a Yahoo News story mentioned in the memo. In the warrant application. And it sort of says, well, that Yahoo News story is based on leaks from the Steele dossier and sources who sort of are part of the same cabal that funded the Steele dossier. And so it's not really corroborating in any way. But a couple of former DOJ and FBI types have kind of gone in the media and said, there's no way the DOJ is really using a Yahoo News story for corroboration anyway. Most likely the Yahoo News story is in there to sort of say, this investigation's gone public. There's reason to believe that the target will soon be concealing his activities because he knows that we're looking into him. Therefore, we have increased urgency. So that's sort of potential nothing burger number 2. And then the final reason that this memo is sort of ineffective is, at this point, the warrant has been renewed every 90 days since late 2016. We can talk about what the standard for doing that is and why it's not particularly high. But one kind of crucial thing is to renew one of these warrants. You have to show not just that you sort of had a basis the way you did initially to get the warrant. You got to show that you got something in the last 90 days that should allow you to continue this eavesdropping. So those are kind of to my mind, the kind of most interesting things about the memo. What about you, Charlie? Anything that stood out in the memo for you that we should flag for our readers before we dive in?
Yeah, I mean, about what was in the memo, I agree that those are the important things and perhaps the only important things. I mean, the process of making it and releasing it is something we'll talk about in a second, but I guess we should also turn right to the fact that pending now, and we're going to talk about this later in the episode, is a Democratic memo that the House Intelligence Committee has voted to release unanimously, which includes lots of Republican votes, that we're currently waiting for the president to authorize or not authorize. We're going to talk about how that works. But one thing that memo almost certainly says is that they did, in fact, tell the FISA court enough about what the source of the Steele dossier to provide all the context that they would need. So that's not even a thing. But even assuming that it were, I think there's an interesting question about whether they have to. And that's what I'd like to talk about now. And so in the popular press, and everyone but me, it appears, seems to be saying that there is no obligation to disclose favorable evidence to a court issuing a warrant when the government has that information. That is not as true as it's stated. There are several circumstances in which when the government knows of a piece of information, it has to tell it to the court when it's seeking a warrant, even at that low standard of probable cause. So probable cause, very low standard. Basically something like substantial evidence to believe that there might be wrongdoing or evidence that you're seeking. It's highly flexible and context dependent, and there are very few rules on what it actually is or isn't, but courts have developed sort of a rough and ready understanding of what probable cause is. And the one thing the government cannot do, and therefore the circumstance in which the government must disclose a piece of information that it has in its possession, is as follows. If there are facts A, B, and C that the government knows, and A and B add up to a crime, but C proves that there was no crime, they can't just go to a court and say A and B. So there is some chance that there's information that the government has in its possession that it would have to tell the court or not seek the warrant. So it's not broadly true to say, well, no matter what they knew about the Steele dossier, they didn't have to tell the court. So imagine that they had no other evidence than the Steele dossier, which is surely evidence. It might not be super persuasive evidence, but it's definitely evidence. And it is probably alone sufficient to establish probable cause if you include some evidence of Steele's reliability, sufficient to convince the court that he's not just making this up. And it seems that his background and reliability in prior investigations suggests that that would actually be a reasonable conclusion for the court. But even if that weren't true, imagine that the government knew that Steele had told them the whole thing was bullshit. I just cooked it up for the Democrats so that they could have it. And then the government presents the application to the court and doesn't say that. Yes, the government has behaved both unethically and probable cause did not exist and the warrant should not have issued. That, of course, isn't what happened, but I think we should be careful not to say that the government never has an obligation to disclose favorable evidence at the warrant stage. They surely do. And furthermore, that favorable evidence can be in the form of identification of who the witness is. So in a case called Florida versus JL, the Supreme Court held that a bare anonymous tip is not even reasonable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing, which is a lower standard than probable cause. So in that case, an anonymous caller just called the police and said, a guy on the corner has a gun, pointed to the guy, I think might have used his name, and then hung up the phone. The court said that does not establish even reasonable suspicion to pat that guy down, because it could just be a random ne'er-do-well who wants to harass a friend.
Right. And we should note that the sort of standard for invalidating a warrant is pretty high. So it's not really just enough that there's got to be some kind of false statement underpinning it. The false statement has to be sort of necessary to the probable cause finding, and it has to be made knowingly or with reckless disregard. That's a case called Franks versus Delaware. So, not really applicable in this case because obviously the FBI and the DOJ knew the provenance of the Steele dossier. But, it is the case that there's got to be some, if you just kind of are sloppy, that's not really enough.
Right. Not enough to overturn, to sort of exclude the evidence, but in the first instance, if you're a FISA court reviewing the document or if you're a government attorney submitting it, then, I'm just what the standard actually is. But at this point, the warrant having issued,
right.
If, for example, you want to exclude evidence obtained on that warrant in, say, Carter Page's criminal trial, he has not been indicted or, to my mind, implicated in any wrongdoing, then, yeah, you would have to prove that they meant to do it.
And we should also know that there's a fairly high tolerance in the case law for bias and informants, right? So, I think sort of part of the theory is that folks who inform either have an axe to grind or are getting some kind of favorable deal, and that's sort of tolerated to a large extent in the law. So that is, even if they revealed everything about the provenance of the Steele dossier, and it sounds like the Washington Post reporting suggests that they revealed a fair amount, that Steele was, even if Steele was incredibly biased, that wouldn't necessarily mean that there's no valid warrant. So there's a Ninth Circuit case where an informant, a warrant is based on the testimony or an affidavit from an informant, and it turns out that the informant was promised a bunch of charges against him would get dropped in order to inform, and they didn't put that in the warrant application. The Ninth Circuit kind of says, the magistrate judge probably knew, that's the deal with informants, right? These cases are cataloged by Orrin Kerr, who has written a sort of helpful post that's basically probable cause is such a low standard, and we tolerate so much nonsense in allowing people to prove probable cause that there's almost no way that this thing is invalid, which I'm not sure I completely agree with, but it is the case that our probable cause law sets a pretty low bar. So there's this Ninth Circuit case, U.S. versus Striffler, he points to, and another case written by my former boss in her former job, so Justice Sotomayor, when she was on the Second Circuit, as a sex abuse case where the affidavit is based on the testimony of the mother, who has this major axe to grind, has this whole history of sort of false allegations against the husband, and they secure a warrant almost exclusively based on this woman's testimony, and Justice Sotomayor basically says, that's fine, she's biased, but it's still probable cause. You have no particular reason to think that her axe to grind makes this information false, and the magistrate judge can kind of take account of that circumstance among others. So it's all just to say that the fact that Steele was biased is not a problem. If they did not disclose that Steele was biased, potentially slightly more of a problem, but even then only if the Steele dossier was necessary to the probable cause finding, and they may have had enough without that, given the Papadopoulos stuff and everything else, and if the sort of omission was also material.
Yeah, there really is very little there. I suppose it's also worth noting that particularly in the context of FISA applications, the witnesses, and there are no live witnesses, but the sources of evidence are nearly universally receiving something for providing it. Like, that's how foreign intelligence works. Like, we've got an embassy official from Russia, and we pay him large sums of money in exchange for information. Then we submit that information to the FISA court and get a warrant for surveillance. That person's bias is even clearer than Mr. Steele's would be, because that person is being paid for the information provided in the warrant application, not was paid to provide the information to someone else that happened to make it into the warrant application. So it's really like not totally out of the ordinary. It's not out of the ordinary at all, I think, to do any of this. And so, I mean, I guess, yeah, there's not a lot to talk about with respect to the actual substance of this memo.
We should note, for what it's worth, FISA, since it was passed in 1978, there's been virtually no turndown. Like, every time the DOJ seeks one of these warrants, it gets one. Now, that A is sort of true more broadly, that, generally when police officers seek warrants, they get them. B is, at least in part a function of the DOJ and their sort of protocol of amassing something higher than probable cause before they go to a FISA court. But that's still sort of troubling, right? It could be that every single one of these things has probable cause, but we know that there's been some surveillance that should kind of raise our eyebrows. There's an Intercept piece from a couple years back we'll link to that talks about, the surveillance of various Muslim American men, including a politician in Virginia, Faisal Gill, on what seems to be very, very, very thin evidence. This is sort of derived from the documents that Edward Snowden released. And, that's not great that FISA courts have signed off on warrants that basically target, probably unjustifiably, at least per this reporting, Arab and Muslim American leaders. So the reason that we're saying what about this memo is because the state of the law is really bad, right? Probable cause is really easy to establish, we disclose very little, and the memo appears to just get the basic facts wrong. But I don't think that should be read to suggest that we're sanguine either about how easy it is to get a warrant generally, or in the particular case of the FISA court, where this is even more troubling because it's all happening. I mean, you never get access to this thing, right? Like, you have no idea at the end of the day what was in this warrant application for the most part. It's even more troubling because this whole thing could kind of happen in this kind of cone of silence.
Yeah, I agree 100% with all of that.
Not that, I mean, again, I don't mean to suggest that the House GOP has any concern about this, right? I mean, they recently...
No, yeah, they particularly don't.
Right.
Although, and I think it's disturbing that some of the bulk collection of data that was, and this is not the subject of this show, and a big part of the Snowden revelations was authorized by FISA, even though it had, to say the least, a thin legal basis, and the Second Circuit held as such before the program was ended. But yeah, the FISA court is super troubling. It's just this is not even close to what would qualify as a troubling instance. Although one thing you brought up I think we should talk about, which is, so there were some allegations that the government was targeting Muslim Americans, perhaps on the basis of their religious beliefs. And the Republicans hint at the fact that the Justice Department was supposedly targeting Trump campaign officials because of an ideological axe to grind that an FBI agent and a Department of Justice lawyer shared in text messages between each other. They were having a romantic relationship, and they also exchanged through these text messages various anti-Trump statements, including, most troublingly, something like, if he can't possibly win, if he does, we'll have an insurance policy against him, which suggests that one of the reasons they were investigating him is because, they wanted to make sure that if he becomes president, they can undermine his administration. Mm-hmm. That's obviously very troubling. If that is truly the motivation for surveilling someone, that's not good. It's unclear what the remedy in law would be, so too with the case in which they're targeting Muslims for surveillance. But, it's surely unconstitutional to do either thing. You can't target someone for surveillance on the basis of her political beliefs. And the FBI has done this for years and years and years. Under J. Edgar Hoover, it was famous for surveilling Dr. Martin Luther King, basically surveilling supposed communists, surveilling anyone who appeared to disagree with the majority view of the government at the time. And that was unconstitutional throughout, and so it remains. As to, again, what the remedy is, perhaps it could be exclusion of the evidence at trial. There's no reason why it wouldn't be, although this hasn't yet been tested. And these text messages between these two people, if they do establish what they say, that's very troubling, right? On the one hand, FBI agents, no less than anyone else, themselves have First Amendment rights to have the political preferences that they desire. But when you are investigating one of the people who is running, it is fair to ask that you be free from bias against that individual person.
Right. Right. And we should note, so we should just make clear the kind of level of connectedness we're talking about here. So the FBI agent, Pete Strzok, I'm going to say. Is that how you say it? I have no idea how to say his name. And the attorney, Lisa Page, no relation to Carter Page, had this conversation, and their texts reflect a meeting with Andrew McCabe, who's the deputy director of the FBI, to discuss this insurance policy. And then the kind of other piece of bias is the person who brings in the Steele dossier, this guy, Bruce Orr, who's deputy attorney general. His wife works for Fusion GPS, which is the firm that hired Steele on behalf of the DNC. And Steele apparently tells him, like, I'm desperate to make sure Donald Trump does not get elected. So there's a bunch of stuff kind of swirling in the ether around this, but it's not clear, at least this memo's telling exactly how that affected the decision to seek this warrant. That is, there are these people who are kind of, we know that Pete Strzok was involved in opening the original Papadopoulos investigation, which probably, in some sense triggered this later Carter Page thing, but it's not totally clear. It's not totally clear what the connection is between these folks who had some kind of clear bias and the sort of seeking of this particular warrant. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the more concerning facts just concern the general investigation. There appears to be no evidence that the Page warrant itself was sought on the basis of improper considerations. And I think this is actually a good time to turn to why the Democrats are attempting to rebut this and how they're going to attempt to rebut this. So the Democrats, led by their highest ranking Intelligence Committee member, Adam Schiff, have drafted a super long 11-page response that when asked, by the way, why he hadn't read it yet, why the president hadn't read it yet, Chief of Staff John Kelly said, because it's really long. It's 11 pages long. So Donald Trump hasn't read a book perhaps in his entire life, or at least in many, many years. So this does seem like a very long memo. And so they've drafted this, and it appears to rebut the factual contentions as we were talking about, and perhaps, who knows, raise other things that the Democrats would like to be in public hearing. It appears that everyone's motivation is either to support or damage the credibility of the investigation at this point. Democrats want to bolster the credibility of the investigation, and Donald Trump's allies, particularly Devin Nunes, who drafted the original Republican memo, want to undermine it through allegations that it's some deep state lunatic conspiracy to get Donald Trump. So that's where we're at politically. That seems like a fairly novice analysis of politics here, but it's a pretty simple situation. So I think the procedure for how these memos are released is legally interesting and raises a question that might come up later this week. So what's supposed to happen, and this has happened exactly once, which is right now, the Intelligence Committee wants to release something to the public. It believes it's in the public interest. It votes to do so. Under House rules, United States House of Representatives internal rules, that vote gives the president 5 days to decide whether he wants to object to its release. If he objects to its release on the grounds that the material should be classified because it either jeopardizes the sources or methods of intelligence gathering or would put American troops at risk, or the president just doesn't feel like it, then he sort of sends a letter saying, I object. And that then allows where I think a potential constitutional problem comes in. The full House of Representatives can then vote to essentially override that decision, which is to say, if the entire House of Representatives by a majority vote approves the release of information, it is released. The reason we're talking about this is, as of this morning, the president's current position on the memo is, I will release it with heavy redaction. Well, they don't describe them as heavy, but I will release them with redactions to protect the sources and methods of intelligence gathering, which is almost certainly bullshit. But I would not be surprised at all to learn that those redactions take out things that the Democrats view as genuinely essential to understanding the memo. And if that happens, they can request a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, and there appears to be a non-zero chance that they will succeed. Recall that the Intelligence Committee vote was 11-0, which includes at least 6 Republicans, and some Republicans appear to be defecting from the Trump conspiracy theory, including none other than sort of Chief Benghazi Inquisitor Trey Gowdy, who has announced his decision not to seek re-election, and recently said that he believes that Devin Nunes' memo does not undermine the integrity of the investigation into the president by the special counsel. So this might happen. And if it does happen, Isha, I wonder if I might be the only person who's concerned about a problem that constitutional law textbooks call bicameralism in presentment. And this line of law essentially requires that in order to do anything that alters anyone's substantive rights or does anything that kind of looks like lawmaking that isn't a treaty or a nomination to a federal post or some of the other things that are within the exclusive provenance of the Senate, or impeachment or trial of impeachment, which happen respectively in each house. The only way to make law other than those things is the House of Representatives votes on a bill, the Senate votes on a bill, and the president signs it. Any other mechanism is impermissible. So the Supreme Court ruled in a couple of cases, most prominently a case called INS versus Chadha, that, one house review of anything or a one house veto or any other sort of creative solution to political logjams and lawmaking problems is impermissible. There's exactly one way to make substantive law. And so if it is the case that declaring a given piece of information unclassified when the president has called it classified is lawmaking, then they can't do this.
What's the case kind of for and against this being lawmaking?
I'm not really sure. Like, that particular question is, to my mind, terra incognita. It's also unclear who would raise this problem. I mean, the president presumably can rely on, well, who knows? This is America these days, but you would hope that the president could say, I want to seek a court ruling on whether you have the power to do this. Don't release it in the interim. But other than that, so it's not exactly clear who would decide this. Everyone appears to be operating on the assumption that there's no problem here, and I'm not 100% sure that's true.
Interesting. I have not heard that speculation, but I do think it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure what the status of classification and declassification is. If anything, it seems
I'm not either.
If anything, it seems sort of more quintessentially executive, but I don't know if that makes the problem better or worse.
Yeah, and it generally speaking, it is surely quintessentially executive in the following sense, that the president is the ultimate classification authority. So there was that problem earlier this year that is now relevant to the investigation, where after firing Jim Comey, the president has this meeting with the Russians at which he discusses things, and then he sort of blurts out a bunch of important classified information about how we learned about the problem with people's laptops on overseas flights. He was sort of bragging about how he got all this intelligence that actually led to the death of a couple of Mossad agents, apparently, which is the Israeli intelligence service. And, if any other person in the government had done that, it would be a crime, because that information was classified until the moment that the president told it to the Russians, at which point it is definitionally unclassified because the president is sole arbiter of what is and isn't classified. And I think Congress sort of overriding that sounds like a law to me. I mean, it does affect substantive rights of people. All of a sudden, people are allowed to discuss something that they weren't allowed to discuss, and it's no longer a crime to reveal it. Like, it alters the content of the criminal law with respect to that information. But I don't really know. And I don't really know that there's an answer to this. I just sort of wanted to raise it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good theory. And I'd be curious to see how it plays out. Like you said, who knows how this thing gets to a court challenge. Trump administration not proven themselves the most adept at kind of navigating the legal system. Yeah, so I just don't know the answer. We should also maybe, on the subject of Charlie's favorite bad lawyers who deserve to be sanctioned, we should also maybe take a moment to give a shout out to Kashyap Patel, who is the author, he's a staffer for Devin Nunes of this memo that seems to, at the very least, have some pretty significant material omissions and at most be sort of selectively written to make things look really bad. Apparently, he has been kind of roundly chastised by several district courts in his kind of past life in the DOJ. In one case, he was the recipient of something called an order on ineptitude that opens with, if the pretentious lawyers from Maine Justice knew what they were doing or had the humility to ask for help from the U.S. attorney for this district. And in another case in Houston, he apparently uses the internet credentials of a different lawyer to give notice that he won't be involved in this terrorism case, and gets excoriated by the judge again. So on Charlie's kind of like hobby horse, that the kind of one of the worst unsung things about this administration is just how incompetent, borderline sanctionable, borderline dishonorable its attorneys are. Mr. Kashyap Patel, who granted was part of the Obama DOJ, to be totally fair, seems to have been the kind of prime mover behind this memo, and has a history of, quote, ineptitude, per the title of an order by a judge in Florida.
Yeah, there's definitely some ineptitude at work here, because it's worth noting like how far from its goal this memo has come. The goal, and it sort of seems very poorly strategically done. So if the goal is to undermine the investigation into Russia, you don't just release this thing and then have members of your own party sort of undercutting the case, that it's not really going to do it. You need to have sort of a group huddle with the entire Republican Party, and they move swiftly in with a coordinated attack to immediately remove the special counsel and say, see, it's all bullshit, and maybe lull us, the public, into the sense that it was not as bad of a decision as it was. Instead, they release the thing, and then they kind of join the circular firing squad of the Republican Party and start talking to each other about how it is good, how it isn't good. Sean Hannity goes nuts and says people should be convicted of treason, and the whole sort of circus begins, and no one's really calling for the removal of Bob Mueller, and the thing didn't really do anything and made Devin Nunes look like a further idiot, which he already looked like. He is an idiot, right? So it might actually just be ineptitude. This lawyer sounds like a real jerk too. I didn't actually know anything about, I kind of assumed that, majority staff on the committee did the actual drafting, but that the congressmen themselves were at least involved in putting together this strategy. But yeah, it sounds like this guy wrote the thing, which was terribly written, but I was impressed that it didn't have any actual typo errors in it, which is what I was expecting.
Right,
I was expecting a version of something written in crayon. Yeah. And it wasn't that. So
it was not written in crayon. Got that. That is very true.
Can we talk briefly about what the New York Times is up to relative to releasing this? Mm-hmm. While we're talking about Trump administration ineptitude at manipulating the legal system or working with it, one of the things that happens when you reveal a piece of classified information is you start to undermine your case for classifying or concealing other pieces of information. So Donald Trump approves of the release of this memo, which includes all this detail about how this secret warrant was obtained. And in response to this, the New York Times files a motion in the FISA court itself, seeking to reveal more, although not necessarily all, documents related to the Carter Page warrant application. And the case that the Times makes, pursuant to internal FISA rules, this is how you make this case. It's in the public interest that you do this because the cat's already out of the bag. We know that the warrant was issued. We know that it was issued for Carter Page. We know that it was renewed. We know essentially the basis of it. And we know all of those things not on the basis of media reports, but on the basis of official government declassified documents. And that's a distinction. Merely because we sort of know it in a broader sense does not mean that we have confirmed it. And so something can still be classified despite the fact, and properly classified, despite the fact that sort of everybody knows what it is. Here, we have official confirmation that the government sought the warrant and why. And so the New York Times, they want the rest of the story. And this application, this motion of the New York Times, is going to go to one of the FISA judges. It's unclear which. It's unclear whether it's going to necessarily be the same judge who authorized the warrant itself. And we don't know who that judge was because it's all truly in secret. And yeah, I mean, I think the Times makes a good case here. I think generally speaking, we should be releasing a lot more of this in the first place, but...
Right. I mean, we should note that no such wiretapping application materials have become public since this whole system was instituted in 1978.
Yeah, there was one kind of close call, though. After the Snowden thing, there was that case in which they revealed a bunch, although not all of the information about how that happened. Right. And that was cited a lot in the Times paperwork. It's a factually different distinction. It's both factually different and it's under a different section of FISA, but it's not like they've never released anything before. They've never released anything like this.
Fair. This would be unprecedented in several ways. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be the other kind of unsealing thing that happened this week is CNN and USA Today have been trying for a while to get the Comey memo. So these are, the former FBI director James Comey famously said in his kind of post-firing tour that he wrote down these very detailed memos after every conversation he had with the president because he was worried the president might lie. CNN and USA Today have been trying very hard to get those. And Judge Boasberg in DDC appears to have solicited testimony from some members of the investigation, including Michael Dreeben, and concluded that actually no dice on the Freedom of Information Act request, at least for right now, because it would interfere and compromise the ongoing investigation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I learned something new on Versus Trump today.
It happens occasionally, folks.
Yeah, I know.
We share some.
So I guess we should proceed to discuss a couple other things and then we'll leave you. So meanwhile, while all of this is going on, and I guess our theme today is updates on the Russia investigation, while all of this is going on, there is talk that Bob Mueller has sought to interview the president and wants to interview him under oath. Initially, the president said, "Oh, of course, I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to doing this. I'm going to testify under oath, but I won't talk to my lawyers about it." And his lawyers, not being quite as stupid as they seem, although this wasn't the unanimous view of his lawyers, have told him not to do it. For the record, I would have begged him not to do it. Right? He'd be out of his mind to voluntarily sit for an interview under oath with Bob Mueller, who's a million times smarter than him, extremely well prepared, already knows a lot about this.
Right. I mean, and we should note, like, presumably the kind of prosecutors and so forth interviewing the media have all basically said, like, you don't talk to Trump until you've got everything else you need, right? Like, this is sort of the apex of the investigation. So presumably at the point where they're seeking to interview Trump, they've done, like, all their information gathering.
Absolutely, yeah. So the way this usually works is you start with, if you have this is according to other podcasts I've listened to, I've never participated in a federal investigation, and I'm likely never going to unless I'm the target of it, which I hope I'm not. The center of the investigation, the person you actually think is culpable or, responsible for the most wrongdoing, you work inward from the farthest away from that person. So you get low-level people to tell you things, and then you use that to get slightly higher-level people to tell you things, and then you kind of roll that all the way up until the big guy. They appear to have gotten to the big guy now, which is Donald Trump. And as I said, they want to interview him. And the way this process works is, Bob Mueller has no power to compel someone to come sit in his office. He has exactly one power. There's an impaneled grand jury. He can issue a subpoena before that grand jury and compel anyone to come testify before it. In lieu of doing that, he offers them as a courtesy the opportunity to just come talk to him under oath as a substitute for going before the grand jury, because going to the grand jury is a slightly bigger pain in the ass. And, so they just offer this as courtesy. If the president declines that invitation, Bob Mueller will then be forced either to issue a grand jury subpoena for the testimony of the president or just let it go. I think the prospect of him letting it go is slim to none, but you never know. So let's assume that the president declines this invitation, which he almost certainly will, and then is subpoenaed before a grand jury. At that point, there appears to be some talk that the presidency is so special that the president can't actually be compelled to give grand jury testimony. Plenty of presidents have, not plenty, but some presidents have testified before grand juries. That's not to say that they can always be compelled to, but that I don't actually see the case at all as to why the president is uniquely not subject to a grand jury subpoena.
Right.
Like, he has the power. I've long argued on this show, and I continue to, that as the president, he can always cause the investigation to be dropped by firing people, as he has full control over the executive branch. So he can eventually just fire Bob Mueller and end the whole thing. But if he doesn't do that, then he's got the subpoena and he has to go answer the subpoena. That said, like every other witness,
we should note on the firing point, there's a Take Care blog post from my former co-clerk, Nico Bowie, that kind of makes the point that under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, which is the kind of statute that allows for filling positions without necessarily going through Senate confirmation, that kind of the ability to do that only applies in cases where someone is sort of unable to carry out their job duty. And during the firing of Sally Yates, this became a big thing because, essentially the Trump party line was she was unable to do her job. Like, she had a moral objection to taking orders from me. That's unable to do your job. And Nico kind of makes a case that if you look at how the word inability is used in other related contexts, like the Presidential Succession Act and like the 25th Amendment, we really don't want it to mean like decided not to do what you wanted them to. We really want it to mean like unable to, like you had a stroke. So it's just a sort of flag that, yes, almost certainly this whole thing can be disbanded at the will of President Trump, but as he fires people, his ability to kind of staff up his administration will potentially be hamstrung.
Yeah, absolutely right. So there are significant consequences to like firing every single person until you find someone down the chain who agrees to fire Bob Mueller, which is what would need to happen because only the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General can fire Bob Mueller. So there's that.
So Attorney General's recused. You got to fire Rod Rosenstein. Anyway, it would be tough to figure out how to get someone into Rod Rosenstein's seat at that point, because you either need Senate confirmation or you need to proceed under this Federal Vacancies Reform Act, and the Federal Vacancies Reform Act potentially limits your ability to just fire someone and then replace them.
Right. And yeah, I mean, one thing he can certainly do, of course, is replace the Attorney General with someone who's not recused. In any event, in theory, I'm of the view that like the president can be indicted and can be subpoenaed and all of these sort of things that are like the president investigating himself. However, the president is always empowered to stop those things from happening, at least in theory. It might be practically very difficult or politically disastrous for him to do that, but in theory, he can stop this investigation. What he cannot do is just throw the subpoena in the garbage. And so at that point, as far as I'm concerned, he has the rights that all witnesses have, which include the Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate yourself.
Which, like,
right. So he can always just say, I'm not responding to the subpoena because you're calling for testimony that would tend to incriminate me. There's lots of reasons why the president doesn't want to do that, because the public has, I think, the incorrect perception that that means you're guilty, right? That that's a concession of guilt. That's not at all what it means. It just means that you want to invoke your right not to be called to testify on a subject that might incriminate you. You have to have some good faith belief, and often you have to do something called voir dire with the judge in order to explain what you're worried about testifying about. It has to be a real thing. You can't just make it up. It can be a very low-level crime that you don't want to testify about that would necessarily come up in your testimony, and this is a trick that is often used not to testify when you don't want to testify for other reasons, but you do just have to invoke it. So you can always do that. I don't think he will, but he can.
Right. And we should note that one kind of very flexible and all-purpose statute, 18 U.S.C. 1001, which is basically the statute that says you can't make a false statement to law enforcement. That's sort of what's been used to flip a lot of people so far, because it actually has some pretty hefty penalties attached to it. And it's almost certainly the case that anything Donald Trump has said or will say will make him fall foul of this statute, right? He can't tell the truth for more than 7 seconds at a stretch, and if that. And so presumably, among other things, his lawyers are just worried that he's going to get in the room, start talking, and commit a crime right off the bat because he's going to make a materially false statement to a law enforcement officer.
I would surely be worried about that. And that is a reason why, of course, he's going to decline to accept the invitation for a voluntary interview. And 1001 doesn't prohibit lying to the media.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
so the fact that he just lies his ass off is not a crime.
Right.
It's a crime when you lie to an FBI agent and it has to at least be kind of material. There's a lot of debate in the case law about what that is. But if you lie about your waist size in an interview, just happen to lie about it, that is not a crime. Although there's actually debate about those kinds of just like immaterial fibs, because unlike other parts of federal law, there's no materiality definition or requirement in the statute itself. It's just a false statement to law enforcement officers. But whatever, setting that aside, he might lie. That's why he's declining it. Through the magic of taking things off the air, listeners, Isha and I just spoke briefly about this statute. The word materially appears. I'm of the view that that's actually modifying the word falsity. I can't remember, and it doesn't really matter, and we're up on the deadline. So what we would usually do is research this for you, dear listeners, and get this right on the air. But like, this is coming out tomorrow and it doesn't matter, so I'm not going to do that. In any event, he lies a lot. What he doesn't have is Fifth Amendment protection from 1001 prosecutions, because he likely has not committed that yet, because he has not spoken to law enforcement about this case. There's also an interesting article that I'll try to dig up. So he lies constantly, but he's been in about 1,000 civil depositions because he's forever suing and being sued. And he has this magical ability to stop his fire hose of bullshit when he's under oath. He actually doesn't perjure himself.
That's fascinating.
He develops the good witness skill of failing to recall at the moment quite a bit, which can be perjury. If you do recall and you say, I don't recall, that's perjury, but it's really difficult to prove. And depending on the specificity of the question, it's almost always possible that you don't at the moment recall exactly the answer to it. But he isn't the usual constant liar when he's under oath. That said, if I'm his lawyer, this is an old man who appears to be in some kind of mental decline. He lies all the time. He's crazed with power. He's up against a really good questioner who knows everything about the circumstance. You're out of your fucking mind to put him in that room, even if you think he's done nothing wrong. Even if you genuinely believe there's no evidence of wrongdoing, you're out of your mind to advise your client to go talk to that person. So I think that there's been some commentary in the press, and one of my friends mentioned this to me, that people are like, I can't believe they're telling him not to do it. What does he have to hide? That's a bit misleading. Even if you actually have nothing to hide, a good defense attorney will often warn her client from speaking with the government for very good reasons, particularly when your client is Donald Trump and not the world's most reliable narrator. So, yeah, I mean, Isha, is there any question about this power of Bob Mueller to issue a subpoena? I can't get my head around why he wouldn't be able to subpoena the president to testify before the grand jury.
Well, I think so. I think there is no dispute about his power to issue the subpoena. That's United States versus Nixon. In that case, it was a subpoena for documents, but the sort of principles there would seem to clearly extend to cover this. I think that the theory, at least it's been kind of leaked in the press by Trump's lawyers, is basically Mueller has gone well beyond the boundaries of the authority he was given. We talked about this on a previous episode. Manafort filed a civil suit on this point. And therefore, I'm laughing because Charlie made an eye-rolling face at me.
That's just a really stupid theory.
He really hated that lawsuit. But like the idea is that there are DOJ regulations that determine kind of the authority of the special prosecutor. When Rod Rosenstein kind of put Bob Mueller in place, he sort of circumscribed his authority in various ways. And one kind of standard talking point from the kind of targets of this investigation is that he has well exceeded the scope of the authority that he was given to investigate. Probably not, as we talked about on that episode. For starters, those things are just kind of internal regulations, and there is a very bad for the world line of case law, or bad for rule of law line of case law that basically says internal regulations, you can violate them at will and doesn't matter, no consequences. That's just, like you said, you're going to do this, you're not going to do it, it's fine. I think that's sort of bad as a general matter, but in this case, it makes it hard to see exactly kind of what the consequences are. But I think that is the theory, that this subpoena is issued kind of well outside the scope of his authority. And I think the people who don't want Trump to be interviewed are in part guessing that if it comes to this showdown, the courts will side with them over Mueller on this kind of can he issue a subpoena question.
Yeah, and that seems
like
totally ridiculous for one additional reason above its ordinary ridiculousness. And fortunately for us, Jason is not on the show today, so we don't have to go back and forth about whether this is a decent theory in principle. Frequent listeners know that I think it's not. But even if it were, the subpoena, if it issues, is just going to say you're called to testify at X time and Y place. It doesn't specify at all what he's testifying about. So it seems impossible to conclude that as a general matter, the subpoena is beyond the mandate of the special counsel because we don't even know what the subpoena is, right? Like it's a subpoena for testimony. He can say during the grand jury testimony, no, I don't want to talk about a corrupt business deal I did in the 90s because that's beyond your mandate. And then he can go to a court, or Bob Mueller can go to a court and ask for an order to compel the president to testify about that. Yeah. That's when we start to run up against questions about Bob Mueller's authority, not when the subpoena issues, because he might just be checking his boxes, right? Yeah. He might say, I was tasked with investigating Russian interference in the United States election. I want to ask you a couple quick questions about that, and then we're done.
Yeah. Right.
That's not beyond it. So this is just yet again another effort at Republican bullshit obstruction. So there's that.
So bad news. Right.
With respect to the voluntary interview, Chris Christie was on TV, mercifully not in the governor's office, saying something like, it's unseemly for the president to sit down with a subordinate and take questions. It's just not done. It's just not what's supposed to be done, which is a subject he's reasonably familiar with, having been interviewed by the FBI in a criminal prosecution in his home state, not one in which he was implicated. But yeah, I don't see why that would be true either.
Right. And again, as Charlie said, there is no power to compel an interview. The point is, right, that like if you don't do the interview, then you're going to get the subpoena and it's going to be harder for you.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. If I were a betting man, which in other aspects of my life I surely am, I'd be saying, yeah, I think Bob Mueller would almost certainly issue the subpoena if Trump declines a voluntary interview, which he almost certainly will. So I think, and, will the president comply with the subpoena? I'd be advising him, unless there's something that I really don't know, I would be advising him to exercise his Fifth Amendment rights and decline to testify. I mean, we have a pretty strong case that he obstructed justice. We now have a lot more information about the false statement that Donald Trump Jr. issued about the meeting with the Russian lawyer that was really about dirt on Hillary Clinton that they said was about, quote, adoptions, which, although true, is deeply misleading. And, that's evidence of criminal wrongdoing. I wouldn't want my client talking about it.
Yeah, fair.
So, okay, we're going to wrap it up there. We've talked about a lot of different things today. We're going to update the show page as usual. Rate us, call us, do all the good stuff. We'd like to point out that our editors at We Edit Podcasts done a fantastic job on this on a short turnaround. They've been doing a generally excellent job. If you have a podcast of your own, we couldn't recommend them more highly. Adios.
Thanks, Charlie.
The red light of the train shines back on me. Call of its whistle, it sinks my very misery.